Ladies and gentlemen, in his commentary and public appearances, Matt Walsh consistently challenges the prevailing narratives surrounding identity politics and what he sees as the weaponization of race in American culture. In his short film, Am I Racist? Walsh doesn't just pose a provocative question, he deliberately exposes the shallowness of how terms like racist are often used in today's discourse. He points out that in many cases, accusations of racism are no longer about rooting out genuine hatred or prejudice. Instead, the term has become a political weapon, deployed to silence dissent and enforce conformity to a particular ideological world. Rather than promoting unity or fostering understanding, Walsh argues that this dynamic sows division, fear, and resentment. He critiques a culture in which simply disagreeing with progressive orthodoxy on issues of race can result in being labeled a bigot, regardless of one's actual beliefs, intentions, or behavior. Walsh takes particular issue with the idea that racism is everywhere and in everything, a concept he sees as both intellectually dishonest and socially destructive. He notes how this mindset leads to a kind of cultural paranoia, where people are taught to see oppression and hate even in neutral or well-intentioned actions. This constant emphasis on systemic guilt, according to Walsh, undermines individual responsibility and moral agency. In his view, progress is not made by endlessly pointing fingers and dividing people into permanent categories of oppressor and oppressed, but by holding each person accountable for their own actions, character, and choices. He calls out what he perceives as a dangerous trend, the refusal to recognize progress already made in racial equality, and the deliberate erasure of facts that don't fit the narrative of America as an irredeemably racist country. Furthermore, Walsh critiques the growing tendency to judge people based not on their own words or deeds, but on immutable traits like skin color or ancestry. He sees this as a regression to a more tribal, less enlightened mind, one that undermines the very principles of individualism and meritocracy that form the foundation of a free society. In his analysis, identity politics reduces human beings to demographics, robbing them of uniqueness and agency. He views this not only as intellectually lazy, but morally wrong. By emphasizing group identity above all else, society loses its ability to have meaningful conversations rooted in shared humanity and mutual respect. Walsh also questions the sincerity of many modern anti-racism efforts, suggesting that for some activists and institutions, the goal is not genuine equality, but power. He claims that race-based activism has, in some cases, become an industry complete with its own dogmas, high priests, and moral currency. Those who challenge its assumptions are not debated but denounced. In this environment, Walsh argues, it becomes difficult for honest, good, faith dialogue to take place. People are afraid to speak truthfully for fear of being accused, shamed, or ostracized. This creates a culture of fear and dishonesty, where real progress is stifled by performative outrage and ideological bullying. Ultimately, Walsh's message in Am I Racist? Is not one of denial but of demand for clarity. He does not claim that racism no longer exists, nor does he excuse real acts of prejudice. Rather, he insists on drawing a clear line between genuine bigotry and ideological coercion. He advocates for a society where individuals are judged by their actions, not assumed guilt, based on their identity. In his view, true justice cannot be achieved through collective blame or cultural shaming, but through personal responsibility, honest dialogue, and a commitment to truth over narrative. This call for a return to moral clarity and intellectual integrity defines much of Walsh's broader commentary on race and culture. In his documentary What is a Woman? Matt Walsh directly confronts one of the most controversial and culturally charged questions of our time. By simply asking various individuals, from everyday citizens to academics, medical professionals, and activists, to define what a woman is, Walsh highlights a deeper crisis in modern society: the rejection of objective truth in favor of subjective experience. What begins as a seemingly simple inquiry quickly reveals a much larger issue, which Walsh believes is at the core of our cultural confusion. He argues that the inability or unwillingness to answer such a basic biological question is not just a quirk of modern language, but a symptom of a broader moral and intellectual collapse. Walsh sees gender ideology not as a harmless shift in language or identity, but as a fundamental attack on reality itself. In his view, when society accepts that gender is entirely fluid and detached from biological sex, it abandons the idea that truth exists outside of personal feeling. This shift, he argues, has dangerous implications. If people cannot agree on basic facts, such as the existence of two biological sexes, then how can there be any foundation for reasoned debate, scientific inquiry, or moral clarity? Walsh sees this as a slippery slope where facts are replaced with feelings, and anyone who dares to dissent from the prevailing orthodoxy is immediately labeled intolerant or hateful. Throughout the film and his broader commentary, Walsh emphasizes that definitions matter. Words are not just sounds. They carry meaning, shape laws, influence education, and define cultural norms. When society refuses to define what a woman is, it not only erases the reality of biological sex, but also undermines the rights and identities of women themselves. For example, when men who identify as women are allowed to compete in women's sports, enter women's spaces, or receive awards intended for females, Walsh sees it as a form of injustice that prioritizes ideology over fairness and truth. He argues that this movement, rather than empowering women, ultimately marginalizes them by denying the very distinctions that define their experiences. Walsh is also critical of how quickly and aggressively this ideology has spread through institutions, especially education, media, and medicine. He points out how children are being taught to question their gender at a young age, often without parental consent or scientific grounding. He raises concerns about the rise in medical interventions such as puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and surgeries being performed on minors in the name of gender affirmation. To Walsh, these are not acts of compassion, but evidence of a culture that has lost its moral compass. He believes that adults have a responsibility to protect children from ideologies that can cause irreversible harm, and he challenges the notion that affirmation is always the kindest or most ethical response to confusion about gender identity. In calling out these trends, Walsh makes it clear that his critique is not born of hatred or fear, but of a desire to defend what he sees as common sense and objective reality. He insists that acknowledging the truth about biology does not diminish anyone's humanity, nor does it justify cruelty or discrimination. Rather, he argues, It provides a necessary foundation for understanding ourselves and each other in a meaningful way. Without shared truths, communication becomes impossible, and society fractures into competing realities that cannot coexist. Walsh also highlights the psychological and social consequences of denying biological reality. He notes rising mental health issues among young people, increased confusion around identity, and the growing tension between free speech and compelled language. In his view, the refusal to answer the question, "What is a woman?" is not just a cultural oddity. It's a reflection of how deeply entrenched relativism has become in our institutions and collective mindset. This relativism, he believes, threatens not only individual well-being but the very stability of society. By posing a question that many are afraid to answer, Matt Walsh seeks to expose the contradictions and consequences of a world that elevates subjective identity above objective truth. His core message is that truth does not bend to feelings, and that reclaiming a commitment to reality is essential for any society that hopes to remain free, sane, and just. In a world where speaking obvious truths is treated as an act of courage, Walsh sees it as a moral duty to say what many are thinking but few are willing to voice.